The cost of everything has gone up, from housing to food and even important stuff like bikes and bike components. One component in particular which I think has exploded in price is just the cost of shifters. A pair of GRX shifters will set you back at the very least brand new, maybe $300, all the way up to $400 or even more if you go electronic. I think a lot of people have just accepted this as the norm, but I always ask myself, is it actually worth it? So as a warning, there are going to be personal opinions in this video. And hopefully that's why you watch this channel, not because I just kind of recite press releases. So if you appreciate this unsponsored content, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or picking up some brand new merch at the merch store. We've got lots of patches and stickers and our brand new Party Pace bandana. If you've ridden or purchased a bike that's been made in, I don't know, let's say the last 30 or 40 years, chances are it does this. And by this, I mean index shift, where you put in one click and it shifts one gear in the rear. And index shifting has actually been around for a while. I think there were some early attempts by Suntour, but ultimately it was refined by Shimano in the 1980s and in the 90s. Since then, it's basically become the standard on new bikes, and for a pretty good reason. It does make shifting a little bit more intuitive, a little bit simpler, but, and this is where I'm going to diverge from most mainstream bike media, is that I do think it introduces a lot of unnecessary complications and expense. And trust me, I've been thinking about this a long time before making this video, and recently I've really started to question whether we actually need index shifting in the first place. I know that this is probably a gross oversimplification, but when you think about it, what does index shifting actually do? It basically translates a motion over here into a coordinated motion in the rear. So for all that money you spend, whether it's $50 for a friction shifter or $600 for an electronic shifter, and what it's doing at its basic form is translating some kind of input up here in the front to a very small movement in the rear, like millimeters. I'm going to lay out a quick pros and cons comparison and explain, why in 2022 I'm actually moving away from index shifting and going back to friction on all our bikes. But bear with me here, there are a few key concepts that we have to talk about. The first one is that rear derailleurs are essentially dumb. There is nothing in the modern rear derailleur that actually limits the number of speeds it can shift to. What ultimately determines the number of speeds on your bike is the shifter. It's just how things have evolved. Shimano did have a rear derailleur system called the positron, where the indexing was in the rear derailleur. It didn't work out so great, and since then everyone else has essentially put all the shifting mechanism, all the things that kind of determine the number of gears in the system in the shifter, leaving the rear derailleur essentially dumb. This is an RX Ultegra 11-speed rear derailleur. And when you look at it this way, there's nothing within the derailleur design that says it couldn't work with a 8-speed system or a 9-speed system or even a 3-speed system. The only actual limiting thing is the width of the derailleur cage here. But in terms of the mechanism, in terms of the sweep across the cassette, there's no reason why this 11-speed rear derailleur shouldn't work backwards with 10-speed, 9-speed, 8-speed, all the way to 3-speed. Another concept I want to get across is that as we've added more gears, the space in the rear hub has become really tight. More gears have meant that things have gotten more complicated. All those gears and moving parts have had to become smaller and more precise. If you think about what a rear derailleur has to do, back in the 6-speed or even the 9-speed days, it did have to sweep across the cassette with a certain level of precision. But if you compare what it has to do now with 12 and even 13-speed cassettes, that level of precision has to be much higher. The movements are a lot smaller, it has to be more precise, so you're not getting caught in between gears and causing chain rub. So basically, as it's become more complicated, it's also become less resilient. Things like cable friction or dirt in the system somewhere become more pronounced. If your bike accidentally falls over and you tweak your derailleur hanger even just a little bit, it's probably going to be enough to throw off an 11 to 12 speed system. So this part is going to be a little bit speculative, but I think that's one of the reasons why there's a big push to go into electronic shifting. If you think about the level of engineering and manufacturing, you're going to need to move the derailleur in such fine increments as more gears are added. The bike industry might be hitting a threshold where it's just much simpler and less expensive to program a motor to move fixed steps than to figure it out mechanically. Before I shift to friction and why I think it's so amazing and why we're switching back, let's summarize really quickly here. Derailleurs are dumb, they don't know how many speeds they have, and what determines the number of speeds that they work with is the shifter. As the bike industry has added more gears, things have had to become more precise, the system more perfect to get those nice crisp shifts. That in turn drives up manufacturing costs, R&D costs, and things become more expensive. The net effect is that the relatively simple task that we ask of the rear derailleur, moving left to right across a cassette, has gotten bonkers complicated and expensive. Now let's talk about friction shifting, which, as you guys know, I'm a big fan of friction shifting. What are the advantages of this seemingly simple, crude Neanderthal mechanism when compared to something as refined as, Shimano's latest offerings? So all you have when you have a friction shifting system is some kind of lever that pulls a cable a set amount of throw. This is similar to what an index shifting system does, but instead of having like predefined stops, you just have all this variability in between. So what that means is that this 11-speed Ultegra front shifter can only ever shift 11 speeds. Whereas this very simple and kind of crude friction shifter, we can shift 3 speeds, we can shift 9 speeds, or all the way up to 20. If we broke this up into 20 steps, we could do it with this. Friction shifting often gets a bad rap because they associate it with down tube shifters. I personally am not a fan of down tube shifters, and if you want to go friction, I do not recommend those. A down tube shifter is a type of friction shifter, but there are actually lots of options. There are bar end shifters like this. There are quasi-integrated road shifters like the Gevinol system, or simple thummy mounts that you can put on flat bars and drops. So with the friction shifting, you've got options. You don't just have to use down tube shifters. Back in the day when all there was friction shifting, the big complaint was that you were getting caught in between gears and causing all sorts of chain rub. And that was true. I'm not here to say that didn't happen. But that was because there were fewer gears, there were bigger gaps to navigate in between the gears. But, and this is going to shock some of you, is that as the bike industry has added more gears, it's actually become better for friction shifting. Because if you think about it, you don't have to make as wide a movement to land in the right gear. Let's look at the arc of the shifter here. If you broke this up into 9 steps, there was a chance that you would land in between. Now let's break this up into 12 steps, and there is a better chance that you can randomly shift it and you're gonna be in gear with no chain rub. This totally sounds counterintuitive, that the more gears you have, the better friction shifting is. I think a lot of people believe that 9-speed and friction was kind of the apotheosis of shifting, but I disagree. I actually think 11-speed and even 12-speed works awesome with friction shifters because you're essentially always in gear. As there become more speeds, it's actually been trickier for index shifting to find the right gear. And conversely, in my experience, the more speeds there are, the better off you are using friction shifting. Go figure. It's like this weird freakonomics thing. Another reason I've switched to friction on all our bikes is maintenance. I mean, once you set it up, all you literally have to do is set the limit screws on the low end and the high end, and that's it. You don't have to deal with any fine-tune adjusting with cable tension. Just get the high limit, low limit, and you'll naturally adjust for any cable stretch or any dirt in the system. It's just absolutely bomb-proof at this point. A couple more reasons why we've gone friction shifting. One of them is the expense. A good friction shifter, which will pull an 11-speed derailleur, is not free. It's going to cost you some money. Don't expect to use the same friction shifter from the 50s or the 70s. You will have to spend some money. But relative to what a drifter costs or what electronic shifting costs, it's pretty cheap, guys. It's pretty cheap. Another huge reason, and I know this is because I'm a bike nerd and I'm always swapping parts on the bikes, is you never have to worry about compatibility issues. For example, let's say I want to swap out my drivetrain from an 11 to 36 in 9-speed, and I want to go 1x to like an 11 to 51 in 11-speed, I can use the same shifter, just change the derailleur. It doesn't matter if it's a mountain bike derailleur. I don't have to get a road derailleur with a goat link or something like that. It just works, and it's super simple. So it gives you the maximum in compatibility and flexibility if you like to mess around with your bike. Another big reason is that it allows you to reuse parts. Like I could use this shifter with this old Sun Tour rear derailleur, which is probably like 40 years old. Or a more modern rear derailleur that was made in the last decade. To me, it really bothers me that, you know, certain parts are rendered useless or no longer compatible just because it's something that was baked into one component. If you believe in reusing things and giving old things new life, then friction is definitely the way to go. One more point about compatibility with friction shifting, you totally leapfrog that whole issue where road components can't talk to mountain bike components and vice versa. If you need to run a mountain bike derailleur, you can do that. If you need to run a road derailleur, you can do that without having to spend hundreds of dollars like upgrading the shifter, just so you can use the rear derailleur and the gearing you want. So, okay, so I know what you're thinking, Russ, that sounds great. Friction shifting sounds awesome. What are the downsides? One downside is that you have to learn something new. You have to devote some time to getting accustomed to a different system. But honestly, give it a week or 2 weeks and you'll figure it out. You're a smart person. Probably the only thing that I sort of miss from an integrated index shifter like this, as opposed to a Gevinol shifter like this, is that you kind of give up the ability to stand and shift. If you're standing climbing, you may have to sit down for a second, shift the bar end or the thummy or manipulate this shifter, but that's about it. And I get it, if you're competitively racing, then that might be a deal breaker. But I think for most everybody, to save money on costs, to have ultimate compatibility, to have a system that's essentially maintenance free, I'll give up standing and shifting. I will throw in a couple caveats. If you're using an old friction shifter, there's a good chance it's not going to work with an 11 or 12 speed rear derailleur. You will have to update your friction shifter. So you might have to get one of the newer microshift friction shifters. I know Diacomp makes a thummy with a larger barrel that works with newer rear derailleurs. I've actually found pretty decent compatibility with the Rivendell shifter, but again, your mileage may vary. Another question that comes up pretty often is, does it work with clutch rear derailleurs? And in my experience, it does. I've used it with SRAM Eagle rear derailleurs, with clutch Shimano derailleurs. Yes, it requires a little bit more force and you have to adjust the tension of the friction, but it is 100% completely viable. Before I close out, one last reason to consider friction shifting, and this is kind of reflective of my darker side of my personality, but with more and more unseen circumstances shutting down production, if you want to keep riding your bike and enjoying it and not having to worry about parts compatibility, factory shutting down, things getting stuck in the Suez Canal, endless and vague back order wait lists, friction's the way to go. Just saying. Once we're living the Mad Max apocalyptic reality, as you scavenge for bike parts in that barren wasteland, you'll be able to shift if you've got a friction shifter. That's what I think. Am I absolutely crazy? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure you already have. And if you like this content, consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon, hitting up the merch store, picking up some stickers, a bandana, a patch, and as always, keep the supple side down.